The dust swirled across the weathered boardwalk as Daisy Morgan clutched her bonnet tightly against the unforgiving Montana wind, her fingers trembling not from the cold, but from the fear that had become her constant companion. The year was 1876, and the small town of Silverridge, Montana, was supposed to be her sanctuary, far from the memories that haunted her back east far from him. Daisy kept her head down as she made her way along the main street, careful not to make eye contact with any of the townsfolk who had begun to recognize her as the new seamstress who'd taken up residence above the general store 2 weeks prior. The less attention she drew, the better. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. The bell above the door to Peterson's general store jingled as she entered, and Mrs. Peterson glanced up from behind the counter, her smile faltering slightly at the sight of Daisy's rigidly held posture. "Good morning, Miss Morgan," the older woman called out. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Yes, madam," Daisy replied softly, adjusting her bonnet to ensure it shadowed her face properly. The bruise along her jawline had faded to a sickly yellow, but it was still visible if one looked closely enough. "Just need some thread and a bit of calico, if you please." Mrs. Peterson nodded, her kind eyes betraying a hint of concern that made Daisy uncomfortable. She busied herself looking through the bolts of fabric, her back to the door, when the bell jingled again. Heavy boot steps crossed the wooden floor, the unmistakable sound of spurs accompanying each stride. Daisy instinctively stiffened, keeping her gaze fixed on the colorful fabrics before her. "Afternoon, Mrs. Peterson," a deep voice drawled, the sound as warm as honey and just as smooth. "Got that order of fence posts in yet?" "Just yesterday, Mr. Sawyer," Mrs. Peterson replied cheerfully. "Clay, have you met our new seamstress? Miss Morgan arrived from back east a couple weeks ago." Daisy felt her heart quicken as she realized she was being introduced. She turned slowly, keeping her face partially obscured by her bonnet, and gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Clay Sawyer stood over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders tapering down to a narrow waist, the evidence of a man who worked hard for a living. His skin was tanned from long days under the sun, and though his clothes bore the dust of the trail, there was something undeniably striking about him. But it was his eyes that caught Daisy's attention, blue as a summer sky and startlingly gentle in a face weathered by the elements. "Miss Morgan," he said, tipping his hat. "Welcome to Silverridge." "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper as she turned back to the fabrics, hoping he would move on. Instead, she felt him step closer, and she reflexively took a step back, bumping into the shelf behind her and sending a spool of ribbon tumbling to the floor. They both bent to retrieve it at the same time, and as Daisy reached for it, her bonnet shifted. Clay's hand froze mid-air, his eyes narrowing slightly as they caught the discoloration along her jaw that she tried so hard to conceal. For a moment, neither of them moved, then he slowly picked up the ribbon and handed it to her. "You don't have to hide from me," he said quietly, his voice pitched so only she could hear. Daisy snatched the ribbon from his hand, her heart pounding in her chest as she straightened, adjusting her bonnet with trembling fingers. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Sawyer," she said, her voice tight. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, as if coming to some decision. "The Double S Ranch is about 3 miles west of town," he said conversationally, his voice returning to its normal volume. "If you ever need any work done, my sister Emily could use some new dresses. She's about your size, I reckon." Before Daisy could respond, he tipped his hat once more and turned to Mrs. Peterson to conclude his business. Daisy quickly selected her fabrics and thread, paid for her purchases, and hurried from the store, the cowboy's words echoing in her mind. "You don't have to hide from me. If only it were that simple." Back in her small room above the store, Daisy set her purchases on the table and moved to the mirror, removing her bonnet carefully. The bruise along her jaw wasn't the worst she'd endured, but it was visible enough to draw unwanted questions. There were others, hidden beneath her high-collared dress, yellowing marks around her wrists where he had gripped her too tightly, a deeper bruise across her ribs that still ached when she breathed too deeply. Edward. Even thinking his name caused a wave of nausea to wash over her. Edward Morgan, the man she'd married at 18, believing his promises of love and security. The son of a successful Boston merchant who had courted her with flowers and poetry, only to reveal his true nature on their wedding night when she'd expressed a differing opinion on the placement of furniture in their new home. 4 years she had endured, making excuses for the bruises, believing his tearful apologies, thinking things would get better. Until the night 3 weeks ago when he'd come home drunk, and his rage had been so severe that Daisy had feared for her life. While he slept off his drink, she had gathered what little money she had secretly saved, packed a single bag, and fled in the night. She'd bought a train ticket west with no particular destination in mind, only knowing she needed to get as far away as possible. When the train had stopped in Silverridge, something about the small but bustling town had called to her, and she'd stepped off, never looking back. Now she was Daisy Morgan, widow and seamstress, trying to build a new life while constantly looking over her shoulder. Clay Sawyer's face floated through her mind, the unexpected gentleness in his eyes, the quiet understanding in his voice. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. Men couldn't be trusted. That was the lesson life had taught her, and she wouldn't forget it again. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sky an endless blue above the mountains that rimmed the valley where Silverridge nestled. Daisy had been up since before dawn, working on Mrs. Wilson's wedding dress. The banker's daughter was to be married in just 3 weeks, and the elaborate gown required Daisy's full attention. A knock at her door startled her, and she quickly smoothed her hair and checked that her high collar concealed the fading marks on her neck before answering. A young girl of perhaps 16 stood on the landing, her blonde hair in a neat braid and her blue eyes shining with excitement. "Miss Morgan, I'm Emily Sawyer. My brother Clay said you might be able to help me with some new dresses." Daisy blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected the cowboy to actually send his sister to her. "Oh yes, of course. Please come in." Emily bounced into the room, her enthusiasm infectious as she looked around at the bolts of fabric and half-finished garments. "This is wonderful. Clay said you were from back east and would know all the latest fashions. I've been saving up, and Pa finally said I could have 3 new dresses for the summer." 3 dresses, Daisy repeated, already calculating the work involved. The extra income would be welcome. "If it's not too much trouble," Emily said, suddenly anxious. "Clay said you might be busy, but he was so insistent that we come to you rather than send away to Denver for ready-made." Daisy asked, her stomach tightening. As if on cue, another knock sounded at the door. When Daisy opened it, Clay Sawyer stood on the landing, hat in hand, his tall frame nearly filling the doorway. "Miss Morgan," he said with a nod. "Hope it's all right that I brought Emily by. She's been driving me half crazy talking about new dresses since yesterday." "It's fine," Daisy said stiffly, stepping back to allow him entry, though every instinct screamed at her to close the door. "Please come in." Clay ducked his head as he entered, his presence immediately making the small room seem even smaller. He glanced around, taking in the neatly organized space, then his eyes landed on the wedding dress draped over the dress form in the corner. "That's mighty fine work," he said, gesturing toward it. "Thank you," Daisy replied, surprised by the compliment. "It's for Sarah Wilson's wedding." "Tom Peterson's a lucky man," Clay remarked, then turned his attention back to his sister, who was already flipping through Daisy's pattern book. "Clay, look at this one. Wouldn't it be perfect for the Independence Day celebration?" Emily pointed to an illustration of a summer dress with delicate ruffles. Clay smiled indulgently at his sister, and something about the genuine affection in his expression made Daisy's chest tighten. Edward had never looked at anyone that way, with pure love untainted by possession or control. "Whatever you want, Em," he said, then glanced at Daisy. "Within reason, of course. Don't want to work Miss Morgan to the bone." "Oh, I don't mind," Daisy said quickly. "I appreciate the business." "Clay's the best brother," Emily informed Daisy earnestly. "He's been taking care of me and the ranch since Pa's accident last year. Pa can't ride much anymore, so Clay does everything." "Emily," Clay warned softly, but she continued. He even turned down that job offer from the cattle company in Wyoming because he wouldn't leave us. And he's teaching me to manage the books because he says a woman should know business, not just housekeeping. Daisy couldn't help but raise her eyebrows at this. Edward had forbidden her from even looking at their household accounts, insisting such matters were beyond a woman's understanding. "Your brother sounds very progressive," she said carefully. Clay shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "Just practical. Emily's smart as a whip. Be foolish not to put that to good use." An awkward silence fell, and Daisy busied herself with retrieving her measuring tape. "Shall we take your measurements, Miss Sawyer?" "Oh, please call me Emily," the girl insisted as she stood with arms outstretched. As Daisy worked, she was acutely aware of Clay watching her, though his gaze never felt intrusive. He kept a respectful distance, occasionally commenting on a fabric Emily selected or asking a question about the process. By the time measurements were complete and fabrics selected, Daisy had relaxed marginally. The Sawyer siblings were surprisingly easy to be around, their banter good-natured and warm. "When should we return for a fitting?" Emily asked as they prepared to leave. "Give me a week for the first dress," Daisy replied, jotting down notes. "We can schedule the others after that." Clay reached into his pocket and withdrew a leather wallet. "How much do we owe you for today?" "A deposit isn't necessary," Daisy began, but he shook his head. "Materials cost money, and so does your time," he said firmly, placing several bills on the table. "We'll settle the rest when the work is done." Daisy wanted to argue but recognized the fairness in his position. She nodded instead, escorting them to the door. As Emily bounded down the stairs ahead of them, Clay paused in the doorway, his voice low. "Miss Morgan, I hope you don't think me forward, but if you ever need anything at all, the offer still stands. The double S is always open to you." Before she could formulate a response, he was gone, following his sister down the stairs, leaving Daisy to stare after him, confusion and wariness warring within her. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity as Daisy worked on both Sarah Wilson's wedding gown and Emily's first dress. The distraction was welcome, keeping her mind occupied during the day, though night still brought with it the familiar nightmares. Edward's face contorted in rage, his hands reaching for her throat. She awoke gasping on Wednesday night, the phantom sensation of fingers around her neck so real that she clutched at her throat, relieved to find nothing there. Sleep would not return, so she lit a lamp and continued her work on Emily's dress, the rhythmic motion of the needle soothing her frayed nerves. As dawn broke, Daisy realized she'd completed not only the dress, but also the embroidered details she'd planned to add as a surprise. Emily had mentioned her love of wildflowers, so Daisy had stitched tiny blue cornflowers along the collar and cuffs, a small embellishment that would add a personal touch. She was just pressing the finished garment when a commotion in the street below drew her to the window. A crowd had gathered outside the telegraph office, voices raised in excitement or alarm, she couldn't tell which. Curiosity overcoming her usual caution, Daisy quickly changed into a day dress, secured her bonnet, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Peterson was already on the boardwalk, her face grave as she spoke with Mr. Jenkins, the blacksmith. "What's happening?" Daisy asked, approaching cautiously. Mrs. Peterson turned, her expression softening. "Train robbery about 20 miles east. 3 men held up the morning train from Denver, took the mail bag and the strongbox." "Anyone hurt?" Daisy asked, her throat suddenly dry. "Conductor got pistol whipped when he tried to stop them, but he'll live," Mr. Jenkins replied. "Sheriff's putting together a posse now." As if summoned by the words, Sheriff Taylor emerged from his office across the street, followed by several men with rifles. Among them was Clay Sawyer, his expression grim as he checked the cinch on his saddle. "Didn't know Mr. Sawyer was a deputy," Daisy remarked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "He's not," Mrs. Peterson replied, "but Clay's the best tracker in the county. Sheriff always calls on him when there's trouble." Daisy watched as the men mounted up, something akin to concern fluttering in her chest as Clay swung into the saddle with practiced ease. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyes finding hers across the dusty street. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement before the posse rode out, disappearing in a cloud of dust. "They'll catch them," Mrs. Peterson said confidently. "Clay Sawyer doesn't give up once he's on a trail." The words should have been reassuring, but they sent a chill down Daisy's spine instead. What if Edward had hired men to search for her? What if he had telegraphed descriptions to law enforcement offices across the country? If Clay was as good as they said, would he unwittingly lead danger straight to her door? The day stretched endlessly as Daisy tried to focus on her work, her mind continually drawn to the window, watching for the posse's return. It wasn't until late afternoon that they rode back into town, their faces dusty and tired. From her vantage point, Daisy could see 3 additional men, hands bound, being led toward the jail. Relief washed over her they'd caught the robbers, which meant Clay and the others were safe. The realization that she cared about his safety was unsettling, and she pushed the thought aside as she returned to her sewing. A knock at her door an hour later startled her. She opened it to find Emily Sawyer, her face alight with excitement. "Did you hear? Clay helped catch the train robbers," she exclaimed without preamble. "And he said my dress is ready for a fitting. Is it a good time?" "Of course," Daisy said, stepping back to allow the girl entry. "I just finished it this morning." Emily gasped when Daisy showed her the dress, her fingers tracing the embroidered cornflowers with reverence. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I've never had anything so fine." The fitting went smoothly, with only minor adjustments needed at the waist. As Daisy pinned the fabric, Emily chattered about the excitement in town and her brother's role in capturing the robbers. "Clay followed their trail through Miller's Creek and up into the foothills," she said proudly. "Sheriff Taylor said they might have gotten away if Clay hadn't noticed where they crossed the creek twice to try to hide their tracks." "Your brother sounds very capable," Daisy murmured, focusing on her pins. "He is," Emily affirmed. "Pa says Clay could have been anything: lawyer, doctor, even a politician, but he loves the land too much to leave it." She paused, then added in a conspiratorial whisper, "And I think he gets lonely sometimes, though he'd never admit it." Daisy glanced up, surprised by the girl's perception. "Lonely? But he has you and your father and surely friends in town." Emily shrugged. "It's not the same as having someone special, is it? Most of the girls around here are already married or spoken for, and the few who aren't." She wrinkled her nose. "Well, they're more interested in the ranch than in Clay." "The Sawyer ranch must be substantial," Daisy commented neutrally. "Double S is one of the biggest in the county," Emily said with pride. "Pa built it from nothing, and Clay's made it even better. We've got the best water rights in the valley and close to 300 head of cattle now." No wonder women were interested, Daisy thought. A successful rancher with land and cattle would be considered quite a catch, even without Clay's obvious physical attributes. "There," she said, placing the final pin. "That should do it. You can take it off now and I'll have it finished by Saturday." As Emily changed back into her own dress, Daisy found herself wondering about Clay Sawyer. He seemed unlike any man she'd ever known, strong yet gentle, capable yet kind. But she'd been fooled before, hadn't she? Edward had seemed perfect too in the beginning. "Clay said to tell you he'll come by tomorrow to pay for the dress," Emily said as she prepared to leave. "He's at the saloon now with the sheriff and the others, celebrating catching those robbers." After Emily left, Daisy tried to return to her work, but found her concentration lacking. The thought of Clay coming by tomorrow made her both nervous and, strangely, anticipatory. She told herself it was simply because he would be paying her for her work, nothing more. As evening fell, Daisy decided to close up shop early. She'd just extinguished the lamp when a knock sounded at her door. Hesitantly, she called out, "Who is it?" "Clay Sawyer, Miss Morgan. Sorry to disturb you so late." Daisy's heart quickened as she relit the lamp and opened the door. Clay stood on the landing, hat in hand, his expression apologetic. "I know it's late," he said, "but Emily told me you'd finished her dress, and I wanted to thank you personally. She hasn't stopped talking about those flowers you added." "It was no trouble," Daisy replied, unsure whether to invite him in. Propriety suggested she shouldn't entertain a man alone in her rooms after dark, but turning him away seemed rude after he'd come specifically to thank her. Clay seemed to sense her dilemma. "I won't come in, madam." "Wouldn't be proper, but I did want to pay you for your work." He reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope. "Emily said you wouldn't name a price, so I asked Mrs. Peterson what would be fair. I hope this is acceptable." Daisy took the envelope, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer. I'm sure it's more than adequate." He nodded, then hesitated, as if wanting to say more. In the lamplight, she could see a bruise forming on his jaw, likely from the day's confrontation with the robbers. "You're injured," she said before she could stop herself, gesturing to his face. Clay touched his jaw ruefully. "One of them got in a lucky punch. It's nothing." "You should put a cold compress on it," Daisy advised, then blushed at her boldness. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, madam, I'll do that." He settled his hat back on his head, then added casually, "The church is having a social after services on Sunday, box lunches and music in the afternoon. Emily's hoping you might attend." Daisy blinked at the sudden change of subject. "Oh, I don't know if everyone will be there," he continued. "Good way to meet folks if you're planning to stay in Silverridge." The question was implicit in his statement. Was she planning to stay? Daisy wasn't sure herself. She'd chosen Silverridge on impulse, with no real plan beyond escaping Edward. "I'll consider it," she said finally. Clay nodded, seeming satisfied with her non-committal answer. "Good night, Miss Morgan, and thank you again for Emily's dress." As he descended the stairs, Daisy closed her door, leaning against it with a sigh. What was it about Clay Sawyer that unsettled her so? Was it simply that he was a man and she had learned to fear men? Or was it something else, the way his eyes seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade? "You don't have to hide from me." His words from their first meeting echoed in her mind as she prepared for bed. If only that were true. If only she could trust that kindness wasn't just another mask, hiding something darker beneath. Sunday morning dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed for church socials and outdoor gatherings. Daisy had spent the past 2 days debating whether to attend, finally deciding that refusing would only draw more attention than simply going. She dressed carefully in one of her better dresses, a pale blue cotton with white trim that she'd made herself, and a fresh bonnet that shadowed her face just enough to make her feel secure without appearing deliberately hidden. The bruise along her jaw had faded to near invisibility, but she still felt exposed whenever she ventured out. The church was already filling with families when Daisy arrived, slipping into a pew near the back. She nodded politely to those who greeted her, but kept her eyes downcast, not wanting to encourage conversation. It wasn't until the service was nearly over that she realized Clay and Emily Sawyer were seated across the aisle, a few rows ahead. Emily wore her new dress, the embroidered cornflowers catching the sunlight that streamed through the windows. The girl turned, as if sensing Daisy's gaze, and beamed, lifting her hand in an excited wave. Clay followed his sister's gaze, his eyes meeting Daisy's. The simple warmth in his smile made something flutter in her chest, an unfamiliar sensation that she quickly suppressed. After the service, the congregation spilled out onto the church grounds, where tables had been set up beneath the trees. Women unpacked baskets of food while men arranged benches and children darted about in excited games of tag. Daisy hesitated on the church steps, considering slipping away before anyone noticed when Emily appeared at her side. "Miss Morgan, you came." The girl looped her arm through Daisy's as if they were old friends. "Everyone's been asking about my dress. I told them you made it, and now Mrs. Sullivan wants to talk to you about making her daughter's wedding dress too. Isn't that wonderful?" Before Daisy could respond, Emily was guiding her toward a cluster of women who eyed her with open curiosity. To Daisy's surprise, they welcomed her warmly, complimenting Emily's dress and asking about Daisy's experience as a seamstress. "Back east, did you say, Mrs.?" Sullivan asked, her eyes sharp with interest. "Where exactly?" "Boston, originally," Daisy replied carefully, "but I traveled quite a bit after my husband passed." "I'm so sorry for your loss," another woman murmured sympathetically. "Was it recent?" "Just over a year ago," Daisy lied, the words bitter on her tongue. She hated the deception but saw no alternative. Influenza. The conversation mercifully shifted to Mrs. Sullivan's daughter's wedding plans, and Daisy found herself agreeing to meet with the girl the following week to discuss designs. By the time lunch was announced, she had secured 2 more commissions and was beginning to feel slightly overwhelmed. "You're quite popular," a familiar voice observed as she helped arrange plates on one of the tables. Daisy looked up to find Clay standing nearby, a glass of lemonade in each hand. He offered one to her, which she accepted after only a moment's hesitation. "Your sister has been very generous with her praise," Daisy replied, taking a sip of the cool drink. "Emily doesn't exaggerate," he said, his gaze moving to where his sister stood chatting with friends, the blue cornflowers on her collar catching the light. "You've got a real gift." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have, and Daisy found herself searching for a response when a commotion near the church gate distracted them both. Sheriff Taylor was striding toward them, his expression grim as he made his way directly to Clay. "Sawyer," he called. "Got a minute?" Clay excused himself and moved to meet the sheriff, the 2 men engaging in a low conversation that Daisy couldn't hear. Whatever news the sheriff brought, it wasn't good. Clay's posture stiffened, his expression darkening as he glanced briefly in Daisy's direction before returning his attention to Taylor. A cold knot of fear formed in Daisy's stomach. Had Edward found her? Had he telegraphed the sheriff? She set down her lemonade with suddenly trembling hands and began to back away, looking for an escape route. She had nearly reached the edge of the churchyard when Clay appeared at her side, startling her. "Miss Morgan," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "May I speak with you privately for a moment?" The fear must have shown in her eyes because his expression softened immediately. "It's not what you're thinking," he added. "Please, just a moment of your time." Daisy hesitated, then nodded stiffly, allowing him to guide her to a relatively secluded spot beneath an old oak tree. She stood with her back straight, hands clasped tightly before her, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. "Sheriff Taylor just got a wire from Denver," Clay began, watching her face carefully. "There's a man asking questions about a woman matching your description in towns along the railroad. Brown hair, green eyes, traveling alone. Calls himself Edward Morgan and claims his wife has run away, possibly suffering from a nervous condition." Daisy felt the blood drain from her face, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint as panic surged through her. "I need to go," she whispered, her voice strangled. "I can't stay here." Clay's hand caught hers as she turned to leave, his grip gentle but firm. "Daisy, wait. No one in town knows about this except the sheriff and me. He came to me because he thought I might have noticed something, given I've spent time with you." "And what did you tell him?" she demanded, fear making her voice sharp. "I told him I'd handle it," Clay replied steadily. "I didn't confirm or deny anything." Daisy stared at him in confusion. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're afraid. I know you've been hurt. And I know that no woman runs unless she has a damn good reason." His curse startled her almost as much as his perception. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then help me to," he urged. "Because right now the sheriff is telling folks that wire was about the train robbers, not about a missing woman. But he can't stall forever, Daisy. If this Edward Morgan files an official report—" "He's my husband," she admitted, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. "I didn't lie about that part, only about him being dead." Clay nodded, as if he'd already guessed as much. "And those bruises you tried to hide when we first met, he did that to you?" Daisy closed her eyes briefly, shame washing over her. "Yes. How long?" 4 years, she whispered. "Since the day we married. At first it was just, he would grab too hard or push me if I displeased him. Then it got worse. The night I left, he—" She trailed off, unable to continue. Clay's hand tightened slightly around hers, not painfully, but enough to ground her in the present moment. "You don't have to say more," he said. "I understand." And somehow, looking into his eyes, Daisy believed he did understand at least as much as any man could who hadn't lived through such terror. "What will you do?" he asked. Daisy shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. If I stay, he'll find me eventually. If I run, I'll just be starting over somewhere else, always looking over my shoulder." Clay was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "There might be another way," he said finally, "but you'd have to trust me. Can you do that, Daisy?" Trust a man after everything? It seemed impossible, and yet, standing there with Clay Sawyer, his hand warm around hers, his eyes steady and honest, Daisy found herself considering it. "What did you have in mind?" she asked cautiously. "Let me talk to the sheriff again," Clay said. "There are laws against what your husband did to you. Maybe not as strong as they should be, but they exist, and Taylor's a good man. He won't just hand you over to someone who hurt you." "Edward is very convincing," Daisy warned. "He can charm anyone when he wants to. He'll say I'm confused or hysterical or that I fell and hurt myself. He always has an explanation." "Then we'll need evidence," Clay replied grimly, "and witnesses. Has anyone else in town seen your bruises? Mrs. Peterson, perhaps?" Daisy thought back to her first days in Silverridge when the bruises had been fresh and more difficult to hide. "Mrs. Peterson may have noticed something," she admitted, "and Dr. Harris, I visited him for a tonic for headaches, but I think he suspected the truth." "That's a start," Clay said. "Will you let me speak to them, discreetly?" The thought of others knowing her shame made Daisy recoil, but she forced herself to consider the alternative: running again, alone and afraid, or worse, being forced to return to Edward. "All right," she agreed reluctantly. "But please don't tell everyone. I couldn't bear it if the whole town was talking about me. Only those who need to know," Clay promised. "And Daisy, if you're worried about staying in town, my offer still stands. The Double S has plenty of room, and no one would question a seamstress staying with us to make dresses for Emily." The offer was tempting, perhaps too tempting. The thought of being somewhere safe, somewhere Edward couldn't easily find her, was almost overwhelming. But to accept Clay's protection meant acknowledging she needed it, and more importantly, that she trusted him to provide it without extracting a price of his own. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Thank you, Clay." He smiled, and for the first time Daisy allowed herself to truly see the warmth in his eyes, the genuine concern that had nothing to do with possession or control. "Whatever you decide," he said, "you're not alone in this anymore." As they rejoined the church social, Clay's words echoed in Daisy's mind. Not alone. After 4 years of isolation, of being systematically cut off from friends and family by Edward's jealousy and control, the idea of having allies was both foreign and desperately welcome. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of conversation and food, with Daisy making an effort to engage with the townspeople who would be her neighbors if she chose to stay. Clay kept a respectful distance, but she was acutely aware of his presence, his gaze finding hers occasionally across the churchyard, offering silent reassurance. As the gathering began to disperse in the late afternoon, Emily approached Daisy, her expression hopeful. "Clay says you might come stay with us for a while to make my other dresses. Is that true?" Daisy glanced at Clay, who stood a few paces away, talking with one of the local ranchers. Had he already assumed she would accept his offer? "I haven't decided yet," she told Emily carefully. "I have commitments in town, Mrs. Wilson's wedding dress, and now Mrs. Sullivan's daughter's as well." "You could still work on those," Emily insisted. "Clay could bring you to town, or they could come to the ranch for fittings. Oh, please say you'll consider it. It's so lonely with just Pa and Clay and old Mrs. Hattie who does the cooking." The girl's enthusiasm was difficult to resist, and Daisy found herself softening. "I'll think about it, Emily, I promise." Satisfied with this response, Emily bounced away to help pack up the remaining food, leaving Daisy to consider her options. Staying in town meant continuing to live alone above the store, where anyone including Edward, should he arrive, could easily find her. Moving to the Double S would provide a buffer, a layer of protection in the form of Clay and his family, but it would also mean placing herself under another man's roof, another man's authority. The very thought made her palms sweat, despite Clay's demonstrated kindness. "You look troubled," Clay observed, appearing at her side as she gathered her shawl. Daisy sighed, too weary to dissemble. "I'm trying to decide what to do. Your offer is generous, but you're not sure you can trust me," he finished for her when she trailed off. I understand, Daisy. Trust has to be earned. It's not just that, she admitted. I've spent 4 years having every aspect of my life controlled by a man. The idea of being dependent on another, no matter how kind, is difficult. Clay considered this, his expression thoughtful. What if it wasn't my house? He suggested, the old Henderson place is about a mile from our main house. It's small, just 2 rooms, but solid. My father built it when he first came here before the main house. It's been empty since Henderson moved on last fall. You'd let me stay there, alone? Daisy asked, surprised. It's close enough that you'd have help if you needed it, but far enough to give you independence, Clay explained. You could take meals with us when you want or cook for yourself, and you'd have somewhere to go if. He hesitated, then finished quietly, if Edward Morgan comes to town. The offer was so unexpected, so perfectly calibrated to address her concerns, that Daisy found herself momentarily speechless. Why would you do this for me? She finally asked. You hardly know me. Clay's gaze was steady, his voice quiet but firm. Because no one should have to live in fear, Daisy, and because I'd like the chance to know you better, if you'll allow it. The honesty in his words struck her deeply. Here was a man offering help with no conditions attached, acknowledging her need for independence even as he extended protection. It was so far removed from Edward's controlling care that Daisy hardly knew how to respond. I need time to think, she said finally. Can I give you my answer tomorrow? Of course, Clay agreed readily. Take all the time you need, the offer stands regardless. As they parted ways, Daisy felt a curious lightness in her chest. For the first time in years, she was being offered a choice, not an ultimatum disguised as concern, not a demand cloaked in the language of love, but a genuine choice with no strings attached. Whatever decision she made, that alone felt like freedom. The following morning, Daisy rose early, her mind made up. After a restless night weighing her options, she'd come to the conclusion that accepting Clay's offer of the Henderson place was her best chance at both safety and independence. She would need to make arrangements for her work in town, but the possibility of continuing her seamstress business from the small house on the Sawyer property seemed feasible. She had just begun packing her belongings when a knock sounded at her door. Expecting it might be Clay, come to hear her decision, she opened it without her usual caution, only to freeze in shock at the sight of the man standing before her. "Hello, Daisy," Edward Morgan said smoothly, his handsome face arranged in an expression of concerned affection that didn't reach his cold gray eyes. "I've been looking everywhere for you, darling." Daisy's throat closed with terror as she instinctively stepped back, her hand clutching the doorframe for support. "Edward," she managed, the word barely audible. He stepped forward, forcing her to retreat further into the room, and closed the door behind him with a decisive click. "You've led me on quite a chase," he said conversationally, though she could hear the underlying tension in his voice. "Do you have any idea how worried I've been, how it looked when people discovered my wife had disappeared in the night?" "I left a note," Daisy whispered, her eyes darting around the room, seeking escape or weapon, anything that might help her. "A note," Edward repeated, his voice hardening. "A scrap of paper claiming you needed time to yourself, as if a wife can simply decide to abandon her husband on a whim." He took another step toward her, and Daisy backed away until she felt the edge of the table against her back. "Do you know what I had to tell people? That you were unwell, that the doctor had warned me you might become confused." "I'm not confused," Daisy said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I left because I was afraid you would kill me, Edward. You nearly did that night." His expression darkened momentarily, then smoothed into one of regretful concern. "I admit I lost my temper. I'd had too much to drink, and when you contradicted me in front of the Hendersons. But I would never seriously harm you, Daisy. You're my wife." The familiar pattern of denial and justification was so expected that Daisy almost laughed. How many times had she heard these same excuses? How many times had she wanted to believe them? "I'm not going back with you," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I've made a life here. I have work, friends." Edward's gaze sharpened, the mask of concern slipping to reveal the anger beneath. "Friends. Is that what you call them? The cowboy who's been asking about you all over town. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Daisy felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you talking about? I arrived last night," Edward said, moving closer, his voice dropping dangerously. "Heard all about the pretty new seamstress and her cowboy admirer before I even checked into the hotel. Clay Sawyer, isn't it? Been spending quite a bit of time with you, according to the gossips at the general store." "It's not like that," Daisy protested, panic rising. "He's a customer his sister needed dresses." Edward's hand shot out, gripping her arm with punishing force. "Don't lie to me," he hissed. "You've always been a terrible liar, Daisy. Your face gives you away every time." Daisy winced at the pain but forced herself not to cower. "Let go of me, Edward. I'm not going back with you. Not now, not ever." For a moment, genuine surprise crossed his face. She had never defied him so directly before. Then his expression hardened into something truly frightening. "You don't have a choice," he said coldly. "You're my wife and you're coming home where you belong. I've already spoken to the sheriff. He knows you're unwell." "Sheriff Taylor knows the truth," Daisy replied, praying it was so. Had Clay spoken to him as promised? Would the sheriff believe a local rancher over a well-dressed Easterner with a convincing story? Doubt flickered in Edward's eyes, then he smiled, the expression chilling in its confidence. "We'll see about that. Pack your things, Daisy. We're leaving on the afternoon train." "No," she said simply. His grip on her arm tightened painfully, and she knew there would be fresh bruises to add to the fading ones. "This isn't a request," he snarled, abandoning all pretense of concern. "Pack your things, or I'll drag you out of here with nothing but the clothes on your back. Your choice." The irony of him offering a choice that was no choice at all wasn't lost on Daisy, but she was saved from responding by another knock at the door. Edward's grip didn't loosen. "Who is that?" he demanded. "I don't know," Daisy replied truthfully, hope surging. "If it was Clay." "Don't make a sound," Edward warned, releasing her arm to move toward the door. "Remember, one word and things will go very badly for both you and whoever's out there." The implied threat turned Daisy's blood to ice. Edward had never threatened anyone but her before, but she didn't doubt he would follow through. The last thing she wanted was for anyone else to be hurt because of her. Edward opened the door slightly, blocking the view into the room with his body. "Yes," he said, his voice once again smooth and controlled. "I'm looking for Miss Morgan," a female voice replied, and Daisy recognized Emily Sawyer's bright tone. "Is she available?" "I'm afraid my wife is indisposed at the moment," Edward replied smoothly. "Perhaps you could come back another time." There was a pause, then Emily's voice, suddenly uncertain. "Your wife, but Miss Morgan is a widow." Edward's posture stiffened. "I believe there's been some misunderstanding. Daisy Morgan is my wife, and I've just arrived from Boston to bring her home. She's been unwell." Another pause, then Emily's voice again, firmer now. "I see. Well, please tell her that Emily Sawyer called and that my brother Clay is expecting her at the Double S this afternoon as arranged. I'll pass along the message," Edward said, his tone clipped. "Good day, Miss Sawyer." He closed the door firmly and turned back to Daisy, his expression thunderous. "The Double S, you were planning to go to this cowboy's ranch. His sister needed more dresses," Daisy said quickly, seizing on the partial truth. "I was going to stay in a separate house on their property while I worked." Edward's laugh was ugly. "Do you think I'm a fool? No, don't answer that. Obviously you do, or you wouldn't have run away in the first place." He grabbed her arm again, pulling her roughly toward the wardrobe. "Pack now. We're leaving as soon as possible." Daisy's mind raced. Emily would surely tell Clay about the strange man claiming to be Daisy's husband. Clay would come looking for her. But would it be soon enough? And even if he did come, what could he do against Edward's legal claims? With trembling hands, she began to remove dresses from the wardrobe, buying time as she considered her options. Edward watched her like a hawk, his gaze never wavering as she folded each garment and placed it in her valise. "Faster," he snapped when she deliberately slowed her movements. "The train leaves at 3. Daisy continued packing, her movements mechanical as despair threatened to overwhelm her. She had been so close to freedom, so close to building a new life where she wasn't afraid every day. Now Edward would take her back to Boston, and things would be worse than before. He would never let her out of his sight again. She was placing the last of her dresses in the valise when heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs outside, followed by a sharp knock. "Daisy, it's Clay Sawyer. Are you all right?" Edward's hand clamped over Daisy's mouth before she could respond, his other arm wrapping around her waist to hold her immobile. "Not a sound," he hissed in her ear. The knock came again, more insistent. "Daisy, Emily told me there was a man claiming to be your husband. If you're in there, please answer." Edward's grip tightened painfully, and Daisy knew she had to make a choice. If she remained silent, Clay would likely leave, assuming she had gone out. Edward would force her onto the train, and she might never have another chance at freedom. With a surge of desperate courage, she bit down hard on the hand covering her mouth. Edward let out a startled curse, releasing her just long enough for Daisy to wrench away and cry out, "Clay, help me." The door burst open with such force that the hinges nearly gave way. Clay Sawyer stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, his expression shifting from concern to cold fury as he took in the scene before him, Daisy with her torn sleeve and reddened arm, Edward with his hand raised as if to strike. "Get away from her," Clay said, his voice dangerously quiet. Edward straightened, his aristocratic features arranged in outraged dignity. "This is none of your concern, Cowboy. This woman is my wife, and I'm taking her home. You're trespassing in a private dispute between husband and wife." "Is that right?" Clay's gaze shifted to Daisy. "Are you going with him willingly, Daisy?" "No," she said clearly, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "I left him because he hurts me, and I'll die before I go back." Edward's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful bitch," he lunged toward her, but Clay was faster, stepping between them and shoving Edward back with enough force to send him stumbling against the wall. "That's not happening," Clay said flatly. "Sheriff Taylor is downstairs, and he'd like to have a word with both of you." Edward recovered his balance, straightening his jacket with precise movements that Daisy recognized as his attempt to regain control. "Perfect. The sheriff can arrest you for assault and explain to this confused woman that she legally belongs with her husband." "Actually," a new voice said from the doorway, "I'd like to discuss the matter of assault with you, Mr. Morgan." Sheriff Taylor stepped into the room, his weathered face grave beneath his mustache. "Mrs. Peterson has provided a statement regarding the condition Mrs. Morgan was in when she arrived in town. Dr. Harris has medical notes documenting suspicious injuries consistent with abuse, and now I find you threatening your wife in the presence of witnesses." Edward's confidence faltered visibly, but he rallied quickly. "These people are strangers who know nothing about our marriage. My wife has been unwell, her mind is not reliable. Ask anyone in Boston, they'll tell you I've been nothing but devoted to her." "I've sent telegrams to the Boston authorities," Sheriff Taylor replied evenly. "Seems there have been concerns raised before, Mr. Morgan. A maid who quit suddenly, neighbors who reported shouting, a physician who treated your wife for suspicious falls on multiple occasions." Daisy stared at the sheriff in amazement. She had never known that others had noticed, had suspected. Edward had kept her so isolated, so convinced that no one would believe her, that she'd never tried to seek help. Edward's expression darkened as he realized his usual tactics weren't working. His gaze shifted, calculating from the sheriff to Clay, then back to Daisy. "This is absurd. Whatever these people have told you, Sheriff, they're mistaken. My wife sometimes harms herself during her episodes. Any injuries were self-inflicted." The casual cruelty of the accusations struck Daisy like a physical blow. She'd expected denial, even anger, but not this calculated attempt to paint her as insane. "That's not true," she said, her voice shaking. "You know it's not true, Edward." Clay's hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support that gave her strength. She straightened, looking directly at the sheriff. "My husband has been hurting me since the day we married. I have the scars to prove it. And I am not going back with him, no matter what the law says." Sheriff Taylor's expression softened slightly. "The law is complicated when it comes to marriage, Mrs. Morgan, I won't lie to you, but no law says a man can beat his wife, no matter what some folks might think." He turned to Edward, his voice hardening. Mr. Morgan, I'm placing you under arrest for assault. We'll sort this out properly with Judge Wilson when he returns next week. Edward's face flushed with fury. This is outrageous. I demand to speak with your superior. I don't have a superior, Sheriff Taylor interrupted calmly. Not for 100 miles anyway. Now you can come peacefully or you can make this difficult. Your choice. For a terrible moment, Daisy thought Edward might attack the sheriff. His face was rigid with rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. But then, abruptly, his expression smoothed into the charming mask she knew so well. Of course, Sheriff. I'm happy to clear up this misunderstanding, he said smoothly. Daisy, darling, we'll talk once this confusion is resolved. He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at Clay with cold hatred. As for you, Cowboy, enjoy her while you can. She'll always be my wife, no matter whose bed she warms. Clay took a step forward, his expression dangerous, but Sheriff Taylor intervened, placing a restraining hand on his arm. That's enough, Morgan. Let's go. As the sheriff led Edward away, Daisy felt her knees give way. She sank onto the edge of the bed, trembling with reaction now that the immediate danger had passed. Are you all right? Clay asked, kneeling before her, his eyes searching her face with concern. Did he hurt you? Daisy touched her arm where Edward had gripped her, wincing slightly. Not badly. I've had worse. She looked up at him, sudden tears blurring her vision. How did you know to come? Did Emily tell you? Clay nodded. She came straight home after meeting him, said something felt wrong. I rode into town immediately and found the sheriff. He hesitated, then added gently, I'm sorry we didn't get here sooner. You came, Daisy whispered. That's what matters. A thought struck her and she looked up in alarm. The sheriff said Edward would see the judge next week. What happens until then? He'll be in jail. For now, Clay confirmed. But Taylor can only hold him so long without formal charges, that's why. He hesitated, then continued carefully, that's why I think you should consider my offer. The Double S is far enough from town that Edward wouldn't easily find you, even if he's released. Daisy nodded slowly. The confrontation with Edward had crystallized her decision. I'll come, she said, to the Henderson place as you suggested, if the offer still stands. Relief washed over Clay's features. It does. We can go whenever you're ready. Emily's probably driving Pa crazy with excitement by now. A ghost of a smile touched Daisy's lips at the thought of the enthusiastic girl. I need to speak with Mrs. Wilson about her wedding dress first, and Mrs. Sullivan. I can't just leave them without arrangements. Of course, Clay agreed, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. Let me help you with that, and then we'll get you settled somewhere safe. Daisy placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her to her feet. His hand was warm and strong, the calluses speaking of honest work, so different from Edward's smooth, manicured fingers that had brought her nothing but pain. For the first time in years, Daisy felt the faintest stirring of hope that perhaps there might be men in the world who were worthy of trust after all. The Henderson place was exactly as Clay had described it, small but solid, with 2 rooms and a covered porch that faced west toward the mountains. It stood on a gentle rise about a mile from the main house of the Double S Ranch, far enough for privacy, but close enough that the soft glow of lamps in the larger house was visible in the twilight. Clay set Daisy's valise just inside the door, then stepped back, giving her space to explore her new home. It's not fancy, he said, a hint of apology in his tone, but the roof's sound and the stove works. Pa kept it in good repair for the hands during roundup. Daisy moved through the small space, taking in the simple furnishings, a table and 2 chairs in the main room, a cook stove against one wall, a narrow bed in the smaller room visible through an open doorway. Someone had placed a vase of wildflowers on the table and hung fresh curtains at the windows. The whole place was humble but scrupulously clean. It's perfect, she said softly, meaning it. After the opulent prison of her Boston townhouse and the cramped room above the general store, this small cabin with its view of open sky felt like freedom incarnate. Clay seemed pleased by her response. Emily put those flowers in earlier, and Mrs. Hattie, our housekeeper, stocked the pantry with basics. She said to tell you supper's at 6 at the main house, but only if you feel up to it. Otherwise, there's bread and cold chicken here. Daisy glanced out the window toward the larger house, suddenly uncertain. Your father, does he know about me, I mean? He knows you're a friend in need of a safe place, Clay replied carefully. I didn't share details that weren't mine to tell, but Pa's no fool, he understands enough. Relief washed through her. The thought of having to explain her situation, her shame, to a stranger was overwhelming. Thank you, she said, for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Clay shook his head firmly. There's nothing to repay. Anyone would have done the same. No, Daisy contradicted softly. They wouldn't have. Most would have told me a wife belongs with her husband, no matter what. She turned to face him fully. Why didn't you? Clay was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. My mother died when I was 14, he said finally. Consumption. Before she passed, she made Pa promise 2 things: to raise Emily to be strong and independent, and to teach me that real strength isn't about power over others. His gaze met hers steadily. I've known men who treat their wives and children like property. Never seemed right to me. The simple sincerity of his words touched something deep inside Daisy, a place that had been walled off for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman, she said. She was, Clay agreed, a fond smile softening his features. You'd have liked her, I think. He glanced out the window where the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. I should let you get settled. If you need anything, just come up to the house, or I can come back later to check on you. Daisy hesitated, torn between her ingrained caution and the genuine desire not to be alone with her thoughts. Would you mind staying a little longer? She asked, surprising herself. Just until it's fully dark. I'm not quite ready to be alone yet. If Clay was surprised by the request, he didn't show it. Of course, he said easily. I could build a fire if you'd like. Evenings get cool, even in spring. As he busied himself at the small fireplace, Daisy moved to the window, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the distant mountains gold and pink. The vastness of the landscape was still new to her, accustomed as she was to Boston's crowded streets and closely built houses. Here she could see for miles in every direction, nowhere for someone to hide, approaching. Beautiful, isn't it? Clay said, coming to stand beside her as the fire began to crackle behind them. It's breathtaking, Daisy agreed. So different from the East, too different. He asked, glancing at her profile. Daisy considered the question seriously. No, she decided. I think I need a different, a place where I could become someone new. You don't need to become someone new, Daisy, Clay said quietly. Just yourself without fear. The simplicity of his insight startled her. How long had it been since she'd been truly herself? Before Edward, certainly. Perhaps even before she'd met him, when she'd still been trying to please her parents, to be the perfect daughter they expected. I'm not sure I remember who that is anymore, she admitted, the confession easier in the gathering dusk. You'll find her, Clay said with quiet confidence. I've seen glimpses already. They stood in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky, leaving only the glow of the fire to illuminate the small room. Daisy was acutely aware of Clay's presence beside her, not looming or invasive as Edward's had always been, but solid and reassuring, like a harbor in a storm. I should go, he said finally, turning away from the window. Let you rest, it's been a difficult day. Daisy nodded, suddenly exhausted now that the adrenaline of the confrontation with Edward had fully worn off. Thank you for staying, she said, and for seeing me. Clay's expression softened with understanding. Good night, Daisy, he said. Sleep well, you're safe here. After he left, Daisy prepared for bed in the small cabin, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night, distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of horses from the corral, the soft hooting of an owl somewhere nearby. As she drifted toward sleep, she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't listening for angry footsteps, for a door slamming, for the sound that would signal danger approaching. She was safe. For now, at least, she was safe. The next few days fell into an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm. Daisy spent her mornings working on Sarah Wilson's wedding dress, which she'd brought with her from town, and her afternoons helping Emily with household tasks or teaching the girl more advanced sewing techniques. Clay's father, James Sawyer, proved to be a courtly gentleman with a dry wit who treated Daisy with unfailing respect, never pressing for details about her past. Clay himself was often busy with ranch work, mending fences, checking on the herd, supervising the hands as they prepared for the spring roundup. He would appear at mealtimes, dusty and tired, but always with a ready smile and a story to share. In the evenings, the family would gather on the porch of the main house, sometimes joined by Mrs. Hattie, the no-nonsense housekeeper who had taken an immediate liking to Daisy. It was during these quiet twilight hours that Daisy began to feel the tight bands of fear around her heart gradually loosening. The simple pleasure of conversation that didn't need to be carefully monitored for potential offense, of laughter that wasn't tinged with anxiety, of looking up to find Clay watching her with gentle appreciation rather than possessive scrutiny, these small freedoms began to heal wounds she hadn't realized were still raw. On the fourth day, Sheriff Taylor rode out to the ranch, his expression grave as Clay met him in the yard. Daisy watched from the porch of her cabin, her heart racing as the two men conversed, Clay's posture growing increasingly tense as the conversation progressed. When the sheriff rode away, Clay made his way directly to Daisy's cabin, his face set in lines of concern. "May I come in?" he asked, removing his hat as he approached. Daisy nodded, stepping back to allow him entry. "Is it Edward?" she asked, her throat tight with apprehension. Clay nodded, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "The circuit judge won't be through for another 2 weeks, not next week as Taylor thought. He can't legally hold Edward that long without formal charges and a hearing." He looked at her directly. "He's being released tomorrow, Daisy." The news hit her like a physical blow, and she sank into one of the chairs at the small table, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "He'll come looking for me," she whispered. "Taylor made him promise to leave town," Clay said, though his tone suggested he put little stock in Edward's word. "But yes, I think we have to assume he might try to find you." Daisy wrapped her arms around herself, trying to contain the trembling that threatened to overtake her. "What do I do? Where can I go that he won't follow?" Clay pulled out the other chair, sitting across from her, his expression earnest. "You don't have to run, Daisy, not unless you want to. This is your home now if you choose it to be, and you have people who will stand with you." "Against the law?" Daisy asked bitterly. "Edward is my husband." "The law gives him rights over me, over my property. Even my own body isn't legally mine." The stark truth of it was something she'd come to understand all too well during her marriage. "The law is imperfect," Clay acknowledged, "but it doesn't give him the right to harm you. And while the courts sort that out, there are other kinds of protection." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Edward Morgan may have legal claims as your husband, but he'll find it difficult to exercise them if he can't get near you," Clay said. "The double S is private property. Neither the sheriff nor Edward has any right to come here without invitation or a warrant, and even if they did." He hesitated, then continued carefully, "Edward would find himself facing not just me, but every hand on this ranch, men who don't take kindly to anyone who hurts a woman." The implied threat in his words should have disturbed her, but Daisy found herself oddly comforted instead. Not because she wanted violence, she had seen enough of that to last a lifetime, but because Clay was offering protection without possession, security without control. "Thank you," she said simply, "but I can't ask you or your men to risk yourselves for me." "You didn't ask," Clay pointed out. "I'm offering. There's a difference." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent on hers. "Daisy, I know you've had little reason to trust men, or anyone else for that matter, but I'm asking you to trust me now, at least enough to let me help you through this." Daisy studied his face, the clear blue eyes that held no deception, the strong line of his jaw that spoke of determination rather than stubbornness, the small scar near his temple that hinted at a life lived honestly, with its share of hardships. In the short time she'd known him, Clay Sawyer had proven himself to be a man of his word, a man of honor. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay, but I want to be prepared in case Edward does come here." Clay nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. We'll make sure you're never alone, for starters." Either me, Pa, Emily, or one of the hands will always be within calling distance, and it might be best if you stayed in the main house for a while rather than out here alone." The suggestion made sense, but Daisy found herself reluctant to give up the small measure of independence the cabin represented. "Could I keep working here during the day?" she asked. "Sarah's wedding is in less than 2 weeks, and I need the space to finish her dress." "Of course," Clay agreed readily, "but someone will be nearby, and at night I'll stay in the main house," Daisy conceded. "That seems sensible." Clay's relief was palpable. "Good, I'll have Emily help you move your things after supper." He rose, settling his hat back on his head. "Try not to worry too much, Daisy. Edward Morgan may be stubborn, but he's one man, and he's not on his home territory here." As he turned to leave, Daisy called after him. "Clay," he paused, looking back questioningly, "thank you for not telling me I'm overreacting or that I should try to reconcile with him. I've heard those things too many times." Clay's expression darkened momentarily. "Anyone who says that doesn't understand what you've been through," he said. "And I'd never presume to tell you what you should do about your marriage. That's your decision, no one else's." After he left, Daisy returned to her sewing, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. But her mind kept returning to Clay's words, to the respect implicit in his assumption that her choices were hers to make, not his to dictate. It was a novel experience, being treated as a fully capable adult rather than a possession to be managed or a child to be directed. By the time evening fell, Daisy had made her decision. She would not allow fear of Edward to dictate her life any longer. She would stay, she would finish her work, and she would face whatever came with the knowledge that, for perhaps the first time, she was not alone. The next day passed in a haze of tense anticipation. Clay rode into town early to speak with Sheriff Taylor, returning mid-morning with the news that Edward had indeed been released but had checked out of the hotel, apparently heading for the train station. "Taylor thinks he's gone back east," Clay reported as they stood in the doorway of Daisy's cabin. "But he can't be certain." Daisy nodded, trying to quell the hope that rose at the possibility Edward might have given up. It seemed unlikely. He was not a man who accepted defeat easily, especially when his pride was involved. "I'll still be careful," she promised. True to Clay's word, she was never left alone. Throughout the day, as she worked on Sarah's wedding gown, there was always someone nearby Emily bringing lunch and staying to chat. Mrs. Hattie stopping by with fresh linens, one of the ranch hands happening to mend a fence within sight of her window. The constant presence should have been intrusive, but instead it felt like being wrapped in a protective embrace, held but not constrained. As evening approached, Daisy gathered her sewing supplies and the partially completed wedding dress, preparing to move to the main house for the night. She had just stepped onto the porch when the sound of an approaching horse caught her attention. Shading her eyes against the setting sun, she could make out a rider coming up the long drive from the main road. For a moment, her heart leapt to her throat, but no, the silhouette was all wrong. Edward was of medium height and slight build, a city man who rode only occasionally in the park. This rider sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. As he drew nearer, she recognized Clay, returning from checking the north pasture. He raised a hand in greeting as he approached, then reined in his horse beside her porch. "Everything all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning the area as if checking for threats. "Fine," Daisy replied, adjusting the bundle in her arms. "I was just heading up to the house." Clay dismounted in one fluid motion, looping his horse's reins over the hitching post. "Let me help you with that," he offered, reaching for her burden. As she handed over the carefully wrapped wedding dress, their fingers brushed briefly. It was a small touch, innocent and fleeting, but Daisy felt it like a current of warmth that traveled up her arm and settled somewhere in the region of her heart. Clay seemed to feel it too, his eyes meeting hers with a question in their depths. For a moment neither spoke, the silence stretching between them filled with something new and undefined. Then the spell was broken by the sound of Emily's voice calling from the main house. "Clay, Daisy, supper's almost ready." Clay cleared his throat, adjusting the bundle in his arms. "We'd better go," he said. Mrs. Hattie gets cranky if her food gets cold. Daisy nodded, falling into step beside him as they made their way up the gentle slope toward the main house. She was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the clean scent of soap, mingled with leather and horses. The way his stride unconsciously shortened to match her smaller steps. The occasional brush of his arm against hers that sent little shivers of awareness through her body. It was a feeling both unfamiliar and frightening, this growing attraction to a man when she had sworn never to trust one again. Yet there was nothing frightening about Clay himself. In every interaction, he had shown her nothing but respect and kindness, asking nothing in return. As they reached the house, Clay paused on the porch, turning to face her. "Daisy," he began, then hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "Yes," she prompted when he didn't continue. "I want you to know that whatever happens with Edward, with the judge, with anything, you have a place here for as long as you want it. No strings attached." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than I can say." Clay nodded, his expression softening. "Good, I just wanted to be clear about that." He gestured toward the door. "After you." The evening passed pleasantly, with James Sawyer regaling them with stories of the early days of the ranch, when Silverridge was little more than a collection of tents and hastily built cabins. Emily played the piano after supper, her youthful enthusiasm more than making up for her occasional missed notes, while Clay sat in his father's old armchair, occasionally catching Daisy's eye with a smile that made her heart beat faster. It was the kind of simple family evening that Daisy had dreamed of as a girl, warm, comfortable, filled with easy laughter and genuine affection. The kind of evening Edward, with his rigid ideas of proper behavior and social obligations, would have sneered at as provincial and dull. Yet there was nothing dull about it to Daisy. The genuine connection between father, son, and daughter, the comfortable way they included her in their conversations and jokes, the absence of tension or fear, these things made the evening more precious than any elaborate dinner party or cultural event she'd attended in Boston. As the evening wound down, Emily showed Daisy to the guest room, a pleasant space with a view of the mountains and a quilt that Emily proudly informed her had been made by her mother. "Pa kept all her quilts," the girl confided. "Says they keep her close somehow." After Emily left, Daisy prepared for bed, the unfamiliar luxury of privacy and security allowing her to relax fully for the first time in days. She was just dozing off when a soft knock at her door brought her fully awake. "Yes," she called softly, pulling the quilt up to her chin. "It's Clay," came the quiet response. "Sorry to disturb you, but I thought you should know one of the hands reported seeing a rider near the south boundary earlier. Probably nothing, but I've posted men to keep watch through the night, just in case." Daisy's momentary peace evaporated. "You think it might be Edward?" "I don't know," Clay admitted. "But I'd rather be cautious than sorry. Try to get some rest. No one will get near the house without us knowing." "Thank you," Daisy said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Good night, Clay." "Good night, Daisy," he replied, and she heard his footsteps move away down the hall. Despite Clay's reassurances, sleep was long in coming. Daisy lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settlings of the house, startling at every sound from outside. When she finally did sleep, her dreams were troubled. Edward's face contorted with rage, his hands reaching for her. Clay's voice calling her name from somewhere she couldn't reach. She awoke at dawn, exhausted but determined not to let fear rule her day. After dressing, she made her way downstairs to find Clay already at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, his expression tired but alert. "Any sign of anyone?" she asked without preamble. He shook his head. "Nothing. Could have been a drifter or one of Henderson's hands checking fences. His property borders ours to the south." He studied her face with concern. "You look like you didn't sleep much." "I didn't," Daisy admitted, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Hattie silently offered. "But I'll be all right," Clay nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I need to ride out this morning. We've got calves to brand in the north pasture. But I've asked Tom Riley to stay close to your cabin today. He's one of our best hands, served in the cavalry during the war." "I appreciate that," Daisy said, sipping her coffee. But please don't disrupt your work too much on my account. The wedding dress needs to be finished, and I can't do that if I'm constantly worrying about being a burden. You're not a burden, Daisy, Clay said firmly. Not to me, not to anyone here. The conviction in his voice warmed her more than the coffee. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. After breakfast, Daisy returned to her cabin, escorted by Tom Riley, a weathered man in his 40s with a quiet manner and watchful eyes. He took up position on the porch, whittling a piece of wood as Daisy worked inside, his presence a reassuring background to her day. The hours passed peacefully as Daisy lost herself in the intricate work of completing Sarah Wilson's wedding gown. The delicate lace overlay for the bodice required her full concentration, and it wasn't until late afternoon that she became aware of how quiet it had grown outside. Setting aside her needle, Daisy moved to the window, expecting to see Tom still on the porch. Instead, the small landing was empty, no sign of the ranch hand anywhere in the immediate vicinity. A tendril of unease curled through her stomach. Tom had been diligent all day, never straying from his post. Where could he have gone? Daisy opened the door cautiously, stepping onto the porch. Mr. Riley, she called, scanning the surrounding area. No answer. Her unease deepened as she noticed other details: the unusual silence, the absence of movement from the direction of the main house. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet. Then she saw a figure moving among the trees at the edge of the clearing, approaching the cabin with purposeful strides. As he drew closer, Daisy's blood turned to ice in her veins. Edward. He was dressed inappropriately for the terrain in his city clothes, his expensive shoes caked with dust, his face reddened from sun and exertion. But it was his expression that sent fear coursing through her, a cold determination that she recognized all too well. Daisy backed into the cabin, closing and bolting the door with trembling hands. Her mind raced frantically. Where was Tom? Where was Clay? How had Edward gotten past them? She looked around desperately for something to use as a weapon, settling on the iron poker beside the small fireplace. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Edward's footsteps sounded on the porch, followed by a sharp knock. Daisy, he called, his voice deceptively calm. I know you're in there. Open the door. Daisy remained silent, gripping the poker with white-knuckled hands, positioning herself against the wall beside the door. Daisy, Edward called again, his voice hardening. Don't make this difficult. I've already dealt with your cowboy watchdog. Open the door or things will go very badly for your friends when they return. Tom, what had Edward done to Tom? Worry for the ranch hand warred with self-preservation as Daisy tried to decide what to do. I'm counting to 3, Edward continued. Then I'm breaking this door down and you'll regret making me exert myself. Daisy knew it wasn't an idle threat. Edward was stronger than his slight build suggested, and the cabin door, while solid, wasn't built to withstand a determined assault. 1. She looked frantically around the small space, seeking another exit. The window in the bedroom was too small for her to climb through quickly. 2. A desperate plan formed in her mind. If she could distract him, slip past him somehow, she might be able to run for the main house. It wasn't far she could make it if she had even a small head start. 3. The door shuddered as Edward slammed his shoulder against it. Daisy pressed herself against the wall, poker raised, waiting. Another impact, and the wooden bolt began to splinter. One more, and the door burst open, Edward stumbling through with the force of his own momentum. Daisy swung the poker, aiming for his head, but Edward was faster than she anticipated. He ducked, the iron missing him by inches, and lunged forward, grabbing her wrist in a punishing grip that forced her to drop her weapon. That was a mistake, Daisy, he said coldly, twisting her arm behind her back with practiced efficiency. I came here prepared to be reasonable, to take you home with minimal fuss, but now I see you've become even more willful during our separation. Daisy struggled against his hold, but Edward only tightened his grip, sending pain shooting up her arm. Let me go, she gasped. Clay will be back soon, your cowboy, Edward laughed harshly. I doubt he'll be in any condition to help you. I left him a little surprise on the trail back from the north pasture. an unexpected meeting with some local troublemakers who were quite amenable to financial persuasion. Horror flooded Daisy at the implication. "What have you done?" "Nothing permanent," Edward assured her with chilling casualness. "Just enough to ensure we won't be interrupted. Now we're going to walk out of here calmly and take the buggy I've hired back to town. The evening train leaves in 2 hours." He jerked her toward the door, keeping her arm twisted painfully behind her. "And Daisy, if you try to run or call for help, I'll make sure your cowboy regrets ever meeting you. Understood?" The threat was clear, and Daisy believed him capable of carrying it out. Edward had never involved others in his violence before, but he'd never been challenged like this either. The cold calculation in his eyes told her he would do whatever was necessary to get what he wanted her back under his control. "I understand," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'll go with you." Edward's grip relaxed fractionally. "That's my sensible wife. I knew you'd come around eventually." As he marched her out of the cabin and down the steps, Daisy scanned the surrounding area desperately for any sign of help. The main house stood silent in the distance, no movement visible. Of Tom Riley there was no sign, though she noticed fresh stains on Edward's otherwise immaculate cuffs that made her stomach clench with worry. A rented buggy waited on the track that led back to the main road, the horse shifting restlessly in the traces. Edward pushed her toward it, keeping a firm grip on her arm. "Get in," he ordered, opening the door with his free hand. Daisy hesitated, one foot on the step, still searching the landscape for any sign of Clay or the ranch hands. Where were they? Surely someone should have returned by now. "I said get in," Edward repeated, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. Daisy was about to comply when the sound of a rifle being cocked froze them both in place. "Take your hands off her," a familiar voice commanded from behind them. Now, Edward tensed but didn't release his grip. "This doesn't concern you," he said without turning. "This woman is my wife and I'm taking her home." "I won't tell you again," Clay said, his voice steady. "Let her go." Slowly, Edward turned, pulling Daisy with him to use as a shield. Clay stood about 20 yards away, rifle raised, his face streaked with dirt and blood from a cut above his eye. Behind him, several ranch hands were approaching on horseback, Tom Riley among them, a bandage visible around his head but otherwise appearing unharmed. "You're outnumbered, Morgan," Clay continued, "and you're trespassing on private property. Leave now and you can ride away in one piece." Edward's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "Or what? You'll shoot me, with my wife standing right here." His arm snaked around Daisy's waist, pulling her tightly against him. "I don't think so." Clay's expression didn't change, but his eyes met Daisy's over Edward's shoulder. Something in his gaze, confidence, reassurance gave her courage. In that moment, Daisy made her decision. She would not be used as a shield. She would not be a passive victim any longer. With a sudden, violent movement, she brought her heel down hard on Edward's in step, simultaneously jamming her elbow back into his solar plexus with all her strength. Edward's grip loosened in surprise and pain, giving Daisy just enough room to twist free. She lunged to the side, putting distance between them as Edward doubled over, gasping for breath. "You bitch," he wheezed, straightening with rage contorting his features. He lunged toward her, hands outstretched. The crack of Clay's rifle split the air, and dust exploded from the ground at Edward's feet, halting him mid-stride. "The next one won't miss," Clay warned, working the lever to chamber another round. Edward froze, his gaze shifting from Daisy to Clay to the approaching ranch hands, calculation visible in his eyes. Slowly, he straightened his jacket, a veneer of composure settling over his features. "This isn't over," he said coldly, his gaze fixed on Daisy. "You're still my wife. The law is on my side." "The law doesn't allow for beating your wife," Clay replied, keeping the rifle trained on Edward, "or for trespassing, assault, or attempted kidnapping, all of which the sheriff will be very interested to hear about." Edward's lips curled in a sneer. "It will be my word against yours, Cowboy, and I'm a respected businessman with connections in Boston. Who do you think the authorities will believe?" "Me," Daisy said clearly, finding her voice at last. "They'll believe me, Edward, because this time I'm not staying silent." This time, I'll tell everyone exactly what kind of man you are. Uncertainty flickered briefly across Edward's face before his mask of contempt reasserted itself. No one will believe you, Daisy. You're just a confused, hysterical woman. Everyone knows that. I believe her, Clay said quietly. So does Sheriff Taylor. So do all these men. He gestured to the ranch hands who had now formed a loose circle around them. And so will the judge once he hears the full story. Edward's gaze darted around the circle of grim-faced men, reality finally seeming to penetrate his arrogance. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and far from his sphere of influence. "This isn't over," he repeated, but the words lacked conviction now. "I'll be back with the law on my side." "You do that," Clay replied evenly. "In the meantime, you're leaving now. And if I ever see you on Double S land again, they won't find enough of you to bury." He nodded to two of the ranch hands. "Pete, John, escort Mr. Morgan to the property line. Make sure he finds his way back to town without any detours." As the men moved to flank Edward, Clay lowered his rifle and crossed quickly to Daisy, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" Daisy shook her head, her eyes fixed on Edward as the ranch hands nudged their horses close, forcing him to move toward his rented buggy. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He didn't have time to do much. Clay's expression darkened as he noticed the bruises already forming on her wrist where Edward had gripped her. "I should have been here," he said, self-recrimination clear in his voice. "His men ambushed us on the way back from branding, took us by surprise." "It's not your fault," Daisy insisted. "Edward is resourceful when he wants something, and I'm all right, truly." She glanced toward the departing buggy, now moving down the track with a ranch hand riding on either side. "But he's right about one thing: this isn't over. He'll come back with legal authority next time." "Let him try," Clay said grimly. "Judge Wilson knows me, knows my family. He'll listen to your side before making any decisions." He hesitated, then added more gently, "But Daisy, we need to be prepared for the possibility that legally, Edward does have certain rights as your husband." The harsh reality of her situation settled over Daisy like a weight. In the eyes of the law, she was Edward's property with few rights of her own. A judge might sympathize, might even acknowledge the abuse, but could still rule that she must return to her husband. "I know," she said quietly. "I've always known that was the risk." She looked up at Clay, drawing strength from his steady presence. "But I won't go back to him, Clay. I can't. I'd rather." She couldn't finish the thought, but understanding dawned in Clay's eyes. "It won't come to that," he said firmly. "I promise you, Daisy. Whatever happens with the law, you won't have to go back to him. There are other options." "What options?" she asked, unable to see any way out that didn't involve either returning to Edward or becoming a fugitive, forever looking over her shoulder. Clay's gaze was steady, his voice quiet but determined. "Trust me," he said simply. "Will you do that, just for a little while longer, despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the lifetime of lessons teaching her that men couldn't be trusted?" Daisy found herself nodding. "Yes," she said. "I trust you, Clay." The words felt like a vow, a commitment deeper than she had intended, but once spoken, she knew them to be true. Against all odds, against all experience, she did trust Clay Sawyer. Not blindly, not completely. She wasn't sure she would ever be capable of that kind of trust again, but enough. Enough to place her future in his hands, at least until she could see a path forward for herself. The next morning, Clay rode into town at first light, returning by mid-afternoon with Sheriff Taylor. They gathered in the main house's parlor, Daisy, Clay, his father, and the sheriff, to discuss their options. "Morgan's still in town," Taylor reported, accepting the coffee misses. Hattie offered with a grateful nod. "Staying at the hotel, making a nuisance of himself. He's been to the telegraph office a dozen times, sending wires to Boston, Denver, even the territorial governor, from what I can gather. Calling in favors," James Sawyer observed grimly. "Men like him always have connections." "What about the men he hired to ambush you?" Daisy asked Clay, worry evident in her voice. "Gone," Sheriff Taylor replied. "Left on the morning stage, probably drifters he picked up in Denver on his way here." Clay leaned forward, his expression intent. "What's our legal standing, Sheriff? If he comes with official papers demanding Daisy return with him, Taylor sighed heavily, setting down his coffee cup. It's complicated. Marriage laws favor the husband, no question about that. But there are limits, especially out here where judges have more discretion than back east. He turned to Daisy. Mrs. Morgan, if you're willing to testify about the abuse to show the judge your injuries, most of them have healed, Daisy interrupted quietly. The visible ones, at least, Doctor. Harris noted them when you first arrived, Taylor reminded her. And Mrs. Peterson is prepared to testify about your condition when you came to town. It might be enough to convince Judge Wilson to grant you protection, at least temporarily. But not divorce, Daisy said, voicing the reality they all understood but hadn't explicitly stated. No, Taylor admitted. Not without your husband's consent or proof of more extreme circumstances than, forgive me, physical abuse alone. The law's unjust in that regard, madam, no denying it. A heavy silence fell over the room as they all absorbed the harsh truth of their situation. Without a divorce, Daisy remained legally bound to Edward. He could claim her property, her earnings, even force her return to Boston if a judge ruled in his favor. There is another option, Clay said slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor as if gathering his thoughts. Not a perfect one, but it might solve the immediate problem. All eyes turned to him expectantly. Daisy could file for divorce on grounds of abandonment, he continued, looking up to meet her gaze directly. It would require her to establish residency here to prove she intends to make Montana her permanent home, and it would take time, at least a year, probably longer. Edward would never allow it, Daisy objected. He'd contest it, claim I was the one who abandoned him. He might, Clay agreed, unless he had reason to believe pursuing you was no longer in his interests. Sheriff Taylor straightened, understanding dawning in his eyes. You have something in mind, Sawyer, Clay nodded slowly. I'm going to talk to Edward Morgan man to man, make him an offer he'd be a fool to refuse. Alarm flashed across Daisy's face. Clay, no, you don't know him like I do. He's dangerous when he's cornered. I'll be careful, Clay assured her, and I won't be alone. He glanced at Taylor, who nodded his understanding. What kind of offer? James Sawyer asked, studying his son with keen eyes. Clay hesitated, then said carefully, a business arrangement. Edward strikes me as a man who values his pride and his pocketbook above all else. I'm betting we can appeal to both. Daisy shook her head, fear evident in her expression. Please, Clay, don't do this. Edward isn't reasonable when it comes to me. He sees me as his property, something that belongs to him. He won't just let me go. Everyone has their price, Clay replied quietly, even Edward Morgan. Despite Daisy's continued objections, Clay remained resolute. He would meet with Edward, with Sheriff Taylor present, and attempt to negotiate a solution that would free Daisy from her marriage without the lengthy and uncertain process of contested divorce proceedings. I'll come with you, Daisy insisted as Clay prepared to leave the next morning. No, Clay said firmly. That's exactly what Morgan wants, to get you back to town where he might have more legal leverage. You're safer here with Pa in the hands. He's right, Daisy, James Sawyer added gently. Let Clay handle this his way. My son may not have fancy Eastern education, but he understands men like Edward Morgan better than you might think. Reluctantly, Daisy agreed to stay behind, though the hours of waiting that followed were among the longest of her life. She tried to focus on completing Sarah Wilson's wedding dress, but her mind kept returning to Clay, imagining confrontations between him and Edward that ended in violence or worse. It was late afternoon when she heard hoofbeats approaching the main house. She abandoned her sewing and rushed to the porch, relief washing through her at the sight of Clay riding up the drive, whole and apparently unharmed. As he dismounted, Daisy hurried down the steps to meet him, searching his face for some indication of what had transpired. His expression was unreadable, but there was a certain set to his shoulders that suggested weariness rather than defeat. What happened? She demanded without preamble. Did you see Edward? What did he say? Clay's mouth quirked in a half-smile at her barrage of questions. Let me get inside and have some coffee first, he suggested, leading his horse toward the barn. It's been a long day. Daisy followed him, unwilling to wait even that long. Clay, please, I need to know. He paused, turning to face her with understanding in his eyes. I know you do, he said gently. And I'll tell you everything, but let me see to my horse first and then we'll talk, I promise. Recognizing the reasonableness of his request, Daisy nodded and returned to the house, where Mrs. Hattie was already preparing coffee and setting out food as if she'd sensed Clay's return. James Sawyer and Emily joined them in the kitchen, both as eager as Daisy to hear the outcome of Clay's meeting. When Clay finally entered, his face freshly washed and his hair still damp at the temples, the suspense was nearly unbearable. He accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Hattie with a grateful nod, took a long sip, and then looked directly at Daisy. Edward Morgan left on the afternoon train, he said without preamble. He's not coming back. Daisy stared at him in disbelief. What? How? What did you say to him? Clay set down his cup, his expression serious. I offered him a business arrangement, as I said I would. $20,000 in exchange for his agreement not to contest a divorce on grounds of abandonment and cruelty. 20,000, Daisy's voice failed her as the enormity of the sum registered. It was a small fortune, more money than she'd ever possessed. Clay, I can't possibly repay that. I didn't ask you to, he replied evenly. The money's from the sale of some land Pa and I have been holding near the railroad line. We've had offers before, but we're waiting for the right opportunity. James Sawyer nodded his agreement. Land's just sitting there doing nothing. Might as well put it to good use. Daisy shook her head, overwhelmed by their generosity. But why? Why would you do this for me? Because no one should be forced to live in fear, Clay said simply, echoing his words from days earlier. And because. He hesitated, glancing at his father and sister, then back to Daisy. Because I care about what happens to you, Daisy, more than I probably should, given that you're still a married woman. The quiet admission hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. Did Edward agree? Daisy asked, changing the subject slightly, though her cheeks had flushed at Clay's words. He did, Clay confirmed. After some negotiation. The money will be transferred to his bank in Boston once the divorce papers are filed and he signs a non-contestation agreement. Sheriff Taylor witnessed the whole thing, and Judge Wilson will make it official when he arrives next week. I don't understand, Daisy said, still struggling to believe it could be so simple. Edward's pride, his reputation, he was so determined to take me back. Money soothes a lot of wounded pride, Clay observed. And as for his reputation, our agreement includes a mutually acceptable story that you came west for your health following a personal tragedy, and during your time apart, you both recognized the marriage wasn't viable. All very civilized and proper. He agreed to that. Daisy asked skeptically, knowing Edward's capacity for vindictiveness. He did, Clay confirmed. Especially after Sheriff Taylor mentioned that any public airing of the true circumstances might include testimony about Edward's violent tendencies. Seems your husband values his business reputation too much to risk that kind of scandal. Daisy sat back, stunned by the neatness of the solution. It seemed too good to be true freedom from Edward, a chance to start over without constantly looking over her shoulder, all arranged with a minimum of public exposure or humiliation. I don't know what to say, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you seems inadequate. Clay reached across the table, his hand covering hers gently. You don't need to say anything, Daisy, just be happy, that's all any of us want. The warmth of his hand on hers, the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet strength that had never once been used to intimidate or control her, all of it overwhelmed Daisy with emotion she could barely contain. I think I will be, she said softly. Happy, I mean, for the first time in a very long time. The days that followed passed in a blur of activity as Daisy adjusted to her new reality, a future free from Edward's shadow. Judge Wilson arrived the following week, reviewed the agreement Clay had negotiated, and officially filed the divorce petition. It would take time to be finalized, but with Edward's signed non-contestation agreement, the outcome was assured. Sarah Wilson's wedding proceeded as planned. Her joy at the perfect gown Daisy had created evident in her radiant smile as she walked down the aisle of the small church. Watching her, Daisy felt a pang of wistfulness for the innocent bride she had once been, walking toward Edward with such hope and trust. But there was something else too, a growing sense of possibility, of a future that might include love again, but a different kind this time. A love based on respect and kindness rather than possession and control. Her eyes found Clay's across the church, and the warmth in his gaze sent a flutter through her chest that was becoming increasingly familiar. They hadn't spoken directly about the feelings growing between them. It seemed premature while Daisy was still technically married, but the connection was undeniable, acknowledged in small gestures and quiet moments of shared understanding. As summer bloomed across the valley, Daisy settled into life at the Double S with growing confidence. She continued to live in the Henderson cabin, which she had gradually made her own with small touches, curtains she'd sewn, wildflowers in jars on the windowsills, a braided rug by the bed. Her seamstress business flourished as word spread of her skill, with clients coming from as far as Helena for her designs. Clay was a constant presence, respectful of her independence, but always available when she needed him. They fell into a comfortable routine breakfast at the main house, days spent on their separate work, evenings often shared on Daisy's small porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. They talked of everything and nothing: Clay's plans for expanding the herd, Daisy's ideas for her business, books they'd read, memories of their childhoods. It was during one such evening in late July, with the air still warm from the day's heat and cicadas singing in the tall grass, that Clay finally broached the subject they'd been circling for weeks. "Daisy," he began, his voice holding an unusual note of hesitation. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you." She turned to look at him, noting the way the dying light gilded his profile, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the slight nervousness in his expression. "What is it?" she prompted when he didn't immediately continue. Clay shifted in his chair, facing her more directly. "I know your divorce won't be final for some time yet, and I don't want to rush you or presume anything. You've been through so much, and the last thing I want is to make you feel pressured in any way." Daisy felt her heart quicken at the direction the conversation was taking. "Clay," she said softly, "just ask." He met her gaze directly, vulnerability and hope mingled in his blue eyes. "I care for you, Daisy, more than I've ever cared for anyone. And I hope that you might feel something for me too, when your divorce is final, when you're truly free. Would you consider a future with me?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. Daisy knew that her answer would shape not just Clay's expectations, but her own path forward. A year ago, even 6 months ago, the idea of binding herself to another man would have been unthinkable. But Clay had shown her, day by day, that not all men were like Edward. That love could support rather than constrain, protect without possessing. "I care for you too, Clay," she admitted, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "But marriage, I don't know if I can face that again, not after." "It doesn't have to be marriage," Clay said quickly. "Not right away, maybe not ever if that's not what you want. I just want to know if there's a chance for us, in whatever form makes you happy and comfortable." The sincerity in his voice, the willingness to adapt his expectations to her needs rather than demanding she conform to his, these were the qualities that had gradually won Daisy's trust, and yes, her heart. "There's more than a chance," she said softly, reaching out to take his hand. "I do have feelings for you, Clay, strong feelings that sometimes frighten me with their intensity. But I need time. Time to fully become myself again, to know who Daisy Morgan or whoever I choose to be really is, without Edward's shadow hanging over me." Clay's fingers tightened around hers, his expression softening into understanding. "Time is something we have plenty of," he said. "I'm not going anywhere, Daisy, and neither are my feelings for you." The simplicity of his acceptance, the lack of pressure or expectation, confirmed what Daisy already knew, that Clay Sawyer was unlike any man she had ever known. That with him, perhaps, she could risk her heart again. Thank you, she whispered, leaning forward to brush a soft kiss against his cheek, their first physical contact that crossed the boundary from friendship to something more. For understanding, for waiting, for seeing me. Clay's hand came up to gently touch her face, his calloused fingers infinitely tender against her skin. You don't have to hide from me, Daisy, he said softly, echoing his words from their first meeting. Not ever. As the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Daisy knew with sudden clarity that she had found not just safety with Clay, but the promise of joy. Whatever the future held, she would face it without her bruises, without her bonnet, without the need to hide who she was or what she felt. For the first time in years, Daisy was truly free. 1 year later, on a perfect September afternoon with the aspen trees beginning to turn gold in the high country, Daisy stood in the small church in Silverridge, her hands steady as Emily adjusted the simple veil in her hair. She wore a dress of ivory silk that she had designed and sewn herself, with tiny cornflowers embroidered along the hem, a reminder of the dress that had brought her and Clay together. You look beautiful, Emily declared, stepping back to admire her work. At 17, the girl had blossomed into a lovely young woman, her enthusiasm tempered now with growing maturity. Clay's going to fall over when he sees you. Daisy smiled, touching the delicate silver locket at her throat, a gift from Clay that morning, containing a tiny pressed cornflower. I hope not. I'd like him conscious for the ceremony. A knock at the door announced James Sawyer, resplendent in his Sunday best, his weathered face alight with happiness. Ladies, he said with a formal bow that made Emily giggle. If the bride is ready, I believe there's a rather anxious groom waiting at the altar. Daisy took a deep breath, smoothing her hands over her dress one last time. Her divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, the papers arriving with Edward's signature already in place and a brief note wishing her well. She had spent the intervening time continuing to build her life at the Double S, her relationship with Clay deepening naturally into the love that had brought them to this day. I'm ready, she said, accepting James's offered arm. As the church doors opened and the small gathering of friends rose to their feet, Daisy's eyes found Clay immediately. He stood tall and straight at the altar, his usually tanned face slightly pale with emotion, his eyes never leaving hers as she moved toward him. In that moment, all the fear and doubt that had shadowed her journey fell away. She was Daisy Morgan no longer, but Daisy Sawyer to be, a woman who had found the strength to flee abuse, to build a new life, and to trust her heart again. When she reached Clay's side, he took her hands in his eyes shining with a love so genuine it took her breath away. You're sure? He whispered, giving her one last chance to change her mind. Daisy's smile was radiant as she squeezed his hands in return. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she replied. As they spoke their vows before the small congregation, Daisy felt the final pieces of her heart knitting back together. The scars would always be their reminders of what she had survived, but they no longer defined her. What defined her now was courage, resilience, and the love of the good man who had seen her bruises and said, You don't have to hide from me. 5 years later, the Double S Ranch had prospered beyond even Clay's ambitious plans. A new wing had been added to the main house to accommodate the growing family Daisy and Clay's 3-year-old son James, named for his grandfather, and their infant daughter Rebecca, whose arrival 2 months earlier had filled the household with joy. Daisy's seamstress business had evolved into a successful dressmaking shop in Silverridge. Managed now by a talented young woman Daisy had trained while she focused on her family and special commissions. Emily, after completing her education in Denver, had returned to the ranch with dreams of raising horses, a venture Clay supported wholeheartedly. On a warm summer evening, as the family gathered on the wide porch of the main house, Daisy watched Clay toss their laughing son into the air, the boy's delighted squeals mingling with the soft sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Emily sat nearby, sketching plans for a new stable while James S.R. dozed contentedly in his favorite chair, Rebecca sleeping peacefully in his arms. "Mama, watch," little James called as Clay swung him around in a circle. "I'm flying." "I see you, sweetheart," Daisy called back, her heart full as she watched her husband's strong hands holding their son with such gentle care. The same hands that had never once raised in anger, that had only ever offered protection and tenderness. Later, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Daisy and Clay sat together on the porch of the small cabin where their relationship had begun. Though they lived in the main house now, they still returned here occasionally for moments of privacy, to reconnect with the place where Daisy had first begun to heal, where Clay had first offered her safety without conditions. "Happy?" Clay asked softly, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Daisy leaned into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of his soap and leather and the indefinable essence that was uniquely Clay. "Completely," she replied. "Are you?" His answer was to turn her face gently toward his kiss conveying what words could not: the depth of his love, his gratitude for her trust, his continuing wonder at the life they had built together. As they walked hand in hand back to the main house, to their sleeping children and the future they were creating day by day, Daisy reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a frightened woman hiding her bruises under a bonnet to the confident wife and mother, it had been a path of pain and courage, of risk and reward. She thought briefly of Edward, wondering what had become of him in the years since their divorce. She had heard through mutual acquaintances that he had remarried, a wealthy widow from a prominent Boston family. Daisy hoped, for the new wife's sake, that Edward had changed, though experience suggested that was unlikely. But that was no longer her concern, no longer her burden to bear. Her life was here now in this valley, on this ranch, with this man who had taught her that love shouldn't hurt, that strength could be gentle, that seeing someone's wounds didn't diminish their worth but revealed their courage. "You're thinking deep thoughts," Clay observed as they approached the house, its windows glowing with welcoming light. "Just counting my blessings," Daisy replied, squeezing his hand, "and remembering how far we've come." Clay paused, turning to face her in the silver moonlight. "From the day a stubborn woman refused to look me in the eye in Peterson's store," he teased gently. "From the day a persistent cowboy told me I didn't have to hide," she corrected, reaching up to touch his face with tender fingers. His smile was soft as he covered her hand with his own. "You never have to hide again, Daisy, not from me, not from anyone." As they entered their home, surrounded by the family they had created together, Daisy knew it was true. The bruises had healed, the fear had faded, and in its place had grown a love stronger than any she could have imagined, a love built on respect, on kindness, on seeing each other fully and accepting what they saw. It was, Daisy thought as she looked around at the life they had built, the truest definition of happiness she knew.